I've had this Seiko SPB143 for about 6 months now. It might fit in my 3-watch collection, but I'm not sure. Welcome to Wrist Swap. I'm Harrison, and I've been trying to complete a 3-watch collection for about 2 years now. I'm gonna have a video pop up there about why I sold all the watches I had collected up to a certain point for my Rolex Explorer. After that, I've been spending a lot of my time trying to figure out what's the perfect 3-watch collection for me, and that's what I've been striving towards. So I try and keep exactly at any given time 3 core watches that I'm wearing. I'll be reviewing my Omega Speedmaster Moon Watch. This is my second watch in my 3-watch collection next Friday. But today what I want to talk about is the Seiko SPB143. I was originally interested in the Seiko model because for me, I was looking for a diver to complete my 3-watch collection. And when I started looking around at the landscape, there were a lot of different options, but I had already allocated a good amount of money towards my Omega Speedmaster and my Rolex Explorer. And so that dive watch piece, I didn't really want to put a huge amount of funds into that one because I wanted to use it for a daily wear at the same time. So I wanted something that was rugged, something that had some water resistance, ideally a dive time bezel, a date function, and came from a brand that I respected. And for me, Seiko is a brand that I really respect. And so this watch, this SPB143, fit all of that criteria. It has a Dia-Shock coating on the outside, which means it's got a little bit of a better hardness than a traditional stainless steel. It has the dive time bezel, it has a date function, it has applied indices. It's a nice, good-looking, versatile watch. So it fit everything that I really wanted. So for the specifications, the SPB143 is 40.5 millimeters wide. It has a lug-to-lug of 47.5 millimeters. It has a lug width of 20 millimeters. It has a power reserve of 70 hours with a 6R35 as the movement powering it. It has a steel bezel insert, 120 clicked unidirectional bezel. It has a thickness of between 13 to 14 millimeters, depending on where you measure it from. The embossed wave on the back actually adds some thickness, as well as the sapphire on the top. It has a 200-meter water resistance rating, and it retails right now for $1,200. Let's start with the reasons that I really like about the model. And one of the biggest things that stands out to me is the general size and the aesthetics. For me, as I've said before on this channel, I'm a modern watch guy, but I like vintage elements thrown in there. And so this Seiko SPB143 has exactly those pieces. It has a very modern look to it, but it harkens back to the 60s models of Seiko's early divers with the 62 mass. And so it has a lot of those elements that make it look a little bit more retro, but the general case design, especially between the color palette of the dial and the bezel, it gives you an overall package that looks quite modern. One of the big advantages to this watch over a lot of others is the general price point for what you get, in my opinion. You get a 70-hour power reserve with an in-house movement with Seiko, you get a great reputable brand, and you get an overall very reliable, beautiful, vintage-looking watch. I think the best competitor to something like this is probably something like the Oris Diver 65 or the Oris Aquis used to be in the same general price point. It's actually a watch that I got my father. This watch has the added advantage of that Dia-Shock coating on it, and for me, I put my daily watches through a beating typically. So I need to have something that's a little bit more resilient. So when I was looking around, this was one of the big things that stood out about this model. And for the first few months, I would say that I really loved it. One of the things that I really didn't like though was the weight. And so at 165 grams, this was pretty heavy for what I'm used to. I'm used to my Explorer, which is like 96 grams with the bracelet on, or my Speedmaster, which with the new bracelet is about 135 grams. So this one at 165 grams, especially given the overall extra thickness, made it a little top heavy and a little wobbly and a little heavy on my wrist. And so for me, I really didn't like that. I actually planned to solve that with this Tropic strap. And this is from Tropic Strap, so you can go to their website. It's named after the strap, or the strap is named after the company. And you can find this strap. I really like this. It's got that vanilla scent, and I'm a big fan. They don't sponsor this video, but I really like their strap. And so I bought this to put it on my Seiko. And it actually slowly found its way onto my Speedmaster instead of on this, although I would transition it every so often. I typically wore this actually on a NATO strap, which I think amplified the things that I didn't like about it, mainly its top heaviness. It bounced a lot on my wrist. And as I've said before, I like my watches very snug. I like them to not move. I like them to disappear. And sometimes I'm okay with the bracelet leaving an indent in my skin because of how tight it is. And so for me, this watch always had a difficult time wanting to bobble forward and back for whatever reason. And so that was a big detriment for me. One of the things I will say about this model is the dial is gorgeous. It's something that I've really enjoyed looking down at, especially for what you're asked to pay for it. I've really enjoyed the applied indices. I've really enjoyed the chamfer edge that follows along that case all the way from one lug to the next. I've also really enjoyed the overall brushed finish, and I think that the layout, especially with the typeface on the numerals, where exactly everything's positioned, even the Prospex X on the dial doesn't really bother me. I think everything is laid in exactly the way that it should be. The date wheel is also a really nice touch. I like having a date wheel that really mirrors the color of the indices around it so that it looks like it kind of disappears a little bit. So I really enjoy that as well. My favorite part about this dial are the hands. So this has hands that are essentially finished differently, one side to the other. So I don't know if you can see it in the macro shots I'm taking, but one of the sides is a brush finish and the other side is a polished finish, and they kind of form this V. And so you get a really interesting way that the light plays off half of the hand in two totally different ways, which is really probably the best piece of this entire watch for me, are those hands. The bezel is something I found interesting. I had expected it to be a lighter gray, and it is sometimes, but a lot of times it mutes back into essentially, a lot of times it looks more black than it does gray. Only in really harsh light does it really shine as the dark gray that it is. And I was worried that there wasn't going to be enough contrast between the bezel and the dial, but there's plenty of contrast. And as I've said, the dial layout and overall design is gorgeous. So why isn't it staying in the collection? And for me, there's a few reasons. One that I've hit on already, and that's the weight. It bobbled around on my wrist a lot, and when I put it on the bracelet, it didn't bobble as much, but then it overall became a much heavier, bulkier package. This bracelet doesn't taper at all. And so when I put it on, it gave me the feeling of something a little bit more utilitarian. And I'm okay with that, but for whatever reason, the layout and the way that these links are designed just give an overall bulkier appearance. And so it seems a little bit dated, which for having vintage cues is interesting that I don't like it, but it's got a little bit of a early 2000s bulkiness to the bracelet that I think is starting to fade into a slimmer, sleeker looking bracelet like you'll find on the new Speedmaster. The bezel itself is also something I've had trouble with. So when I start to rotate this, it's got a lot of built-in friction on it. So it takes a little bit of effort to even get it moving in some spots. Especially if I let this sit for a while, what I'll find is that it's harder to turn that bezel because a lot of that friction is built in to give you that resistance. And so that friction just kind of builds. I had one time where I set it down for 3 weeks, and by the time I put it on again, it was a lot harder to turn that bezel, and it took me a little while to get it going. So that's one thing that I don't like. The bezel also doesn't line up. So this doesn't have a chapter ring, so you don't have to worry about that lining up, but this bezel doesn't line up perfectly with that 12 o'clock indice, which we all know is a common Seiko problem. The last thing for me is something that's common in almost every Seiko model, and that is, it's really small, but it's something that always bothers me, which is when you put the crown back in. So when you unscrew it, the crown pops out. When you go to put that crown back in, you can feel the movement still winding even as you're screwing in crown. And the other watches that I have, like any Tudor I used to have, or any Rolex, or some of the other watches I've had, even the Oris watches, they don't have that feeling. And I'm sure it has to do with the movement architecture, but it's something that always bothers me about Seiko watches, that when I push the crown in and then start to screw it into a closed, watertight, fixed position, I always have that feeling of the movement that still is winding behind it. And Seikos, as most of you know, if you've handled a Seiko, have a lot more of a tactile and interesting feel to winding those movements. They don't really change from the lower end to a model like this. So for me, in the end, this watch is beautiful. It's great. It could be a perfect one watch collection for a lot of people. And if I had first gotten to watch collecting, I'm sure I would have picked this up just like I have now. But for me now, when I'm trying to keep everything to a core 3 watches, I have to love each and every single piece. And what I found with this piece is that often I will gravitate towards my Speedmaster or my Explorer because I like them more than this one. I don't like this equally in any way. And so for me, it's not sticking around for that reason. Some of the negatives do bother me, and some of the positives are part of the reason why I bought it and why I've enjoyed it for so long. But in the end, it's gonna be heading out, and so we'll keep on the hunt and try and find that nice third piece for my collection. Do me a favor and subscribe. Like the video if you like videos like this. Leave me a comment. Give me some ideas. I'm looking to try and complete my 3 watch collection, and so give me some ideas of what would round it out. Let me know what your suggestions are. Let me know what you think of the SPB143 and whether or not you have it in your collection and how you feel about it. Like I said, next week I'll be talking about my Omega Speedmaster right here, and I'll be talking through exactly why it has been the perfect second piece to what was my 2 watch collection.